Good evening. I want to begin by saying thank you so much to Ms. Smith and to the entire staff of the Burlington Public Library for this invitation to share and join in on a very meaningful discussion that is very important to our country and hopefully to all human beings during this time, as we should all be able to empathize with the suffering of other oppressed persons. This is not my first time at the Burlington Library. I am excited to be back again. The first time I had an opportunity to lecture and talk on my dissertation research, and I was struggling to complete it at that particular time. Now I'm invited back on the other end of the spectrum, but this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Racism and its systemic nature in this country is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart as an African American and as a Black person. But I just want to begin by saying that my primary field of study is not race theory. For that reason, I wanted to invite two brilliant thinkers and two brilliant minds to participate in a discussion with me that we might, from our various perspectives and position, myself as a pastor and as an academician in the fields of ecclesiology and theology, particularly Black theology and Black ecclesiology. Reverend Johnson, who is an African-American minister, but she is also an assistant director for Upward Bound, and she works with young people who often fit into the category that we're going to be discussing this evening. And then Minister Devon Crawford, who is also a minister of the gospel, but you heard in his bio his level of activism in Chicago. But not only that, he is also a continuing to do the work of social justice in the academy there at Harvard Kennedy School. So my hope and desire was to create a zone of discussion amongst Black minds for those who are interested in trying to figure out how to be anti-racist and what it means to dismantle racism, to glean and listen in on this discussion that's going to be focused on Black concerns, Black thought, and Black emotion, and Black feeling, and Black rage, and not taking into consideration whiteness as a variable at all, except for that which needs to be dismantled and that which needs to be viewed as an obstacle to Black people. And the thought is that oftentimes, and we'll get to this in a moment, the question is asked by white persons of me quite often, and I'm sure Reverend Johnson and Minister Crawford will be able to speak to this when they jump on the screen of, well, what do you want us to do? A lot of my white colleagues, they reach out to me and they say, Brandon, what can we do? Organizations are constantly reaching out to me and saying, what can we do? Well, the first thing I admonish white institutions to do is to pay African-American consultants. And when we are reaching out to people to give us this information who fit into that oppressed demographic, to pay them, because it is not fair for us to experience the burden of systemic racism and then to have the responsibility of also trying to dismantle it on our own. So in that light, what I wanted to do is to give, in a very honest and open way, an opportunity for Caucasian ears and white persons to hear a conversation amongst Black thinkers about the topic of systemic racism. I'm going to begin by asking if we could bring my two discussion partners up on the screen. And I just want to give some opening words as we begin to just set some parameters on how we're defining things. Let's talk about race first. Most historians, anthropologists, and sociologists describe human races as social constructs. That's an important phrase I want you to think about, social constructs. And furthermore, our American notion of what constitutes whiteness and what constitutes Blackness is also a product of social context. More than 100 years ago, American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois was concerned that race was being used as a biological explanation for what he understood to be social and cultural differences between different populations of people. Du Bois spoke out against the idea of white and black as distinct groups or discrete groups, claiming that these distinctions ignored the scope of human diversity. And as a social construct, the fear or perceived inferiority of a particular race that has been separated from another, in this context, we're talking about Blackness, is what we define as racism. Police brutality, gentrification, subpar schools in urban contexts, mass incarceration, on and on, are all results of the fear or perceived inferiority in some way of a particular race of people in America. And in this context, those people are African Americans, Black people. Now, as we begin this conversation this evening, I want to start by just saying you're going to hear us talking a lot about Black history, the history of Black peoples in this country. And this is because the only way to fully understand racism in America is for us to interrogate America's long history of injustice and inequality towards Black people. Beginning with the racist tradition of slavery in this country, which began, in my argument, as a form of economic exploitation rooted in Eurocentric xenophobia, eventually morphed into racism when enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas, where the social constructs of this place were explicitly pro-white. And we try to expand those definitions of man now in the form of the Constitution. But the truth is they were explicitly white and male. This is the history that America has tried to ignore, especially white liberal America, and dare I even say white liberal New England America, through its tokenism of persons like Barack Obama. However, the video of George Floyd's death at the hands of police in Minnesota exposed this long-standing racial inequality that actually exists in every aspect of American life. This is why we call it systemic. And because of the intersection between the two worlds of the global health pandemic and the epidemic of racial inequity in this country, and people being locked in their homes and forced to watch television and to flip through their phones or computers through social media, we've arrived at this moment in this country of deep reckoning across our society. And our discussion this evening is to try and open up this wound, to expose it for what it is, and to bring some suggestions to the table about what we think America, specifically white America, should and could do. The first question that I'm going to ask the two panelists, and I'm going to answer myself, is to describe your racial or ethnic background and the first time that you realized that you belonged to an oppressed group. My response to this question would be that I first realized this in the 6th grade when I was told by my grandparents who raised me that there was a certain neighborhood in Cedartown, and I'm not going to name it because I don't want any hate mail coming towards me, but there was a certain part of town that Black people were not supposed to go to. And I had a friend who wanted me to go and hang out with him, and they said, that was white, and they said, you can't go and hang out with him because he lives in an area that traditionally has been the location of the KKK. And I said, what's the KKK? And they explained to me what the KKK had been historically towards Black people, and that it still existed in my small town of Cedartown, Georgia. At that time, too, I had not fully come into my full awareness, and I was also dating this girl by the name, or I won't say her name, I won't do that, but I was dating this young lady who also lived in this section of town. And her father had a conversation with my great-grandfather, Leroy Phillips, and he then had a conversation with me, explaining that as a Black person, that I could not be in that sort of relationship with a white person. This person, this young lady, happened to be white. It was at that age that I realized that there was difference, and it opened my eyes to a lot of things that I had ignored prior to this point. We're going to go to Reverend Johnson in this moment. Reverend Johnson, can you answer that question?
I would be happy to. I certainly identify as African American. I cannot recall a time of ever knowing that I wasn't African American. That my parents were very intentional about ensuring that I understood that, and that I knew that. And I think that really sort of obscures for me a little bit a time of recognizing what that really meant in a political sense. In the country, but experientially, the first time that I really realized that was in school. And it was related to a situation that happened very early on. This is early elementary school, that there was some work that we were doing. We were learning, the kind of things that you learn in first grade and such, and having this experience of having a teacher who was not my teacher, but another teacher in the school, to tell me, as I was not really a rambunctious child on the playground, I was that kid that found a spot under a tree and sat and read and, did things like that in the clay, and I would mess up my shoes and, those sorts of things. And my mother would get upset about that. But I was reading, and the teacher that walked up to me and said, "You should not be reading that kind of book. That's not for you." And I had to talk to my mother, my grandmother, and my father, and understand what "you" really meant and what she meant by that. Because I said, "Oh, I can read it." It was, on a different grade level from me, but my parents pushed me to learn how to do those sorts of things. And it was that experience of setting expectation lower for me, even as a young child, than was set for my peers. And that there was something inherently wrong with me being able to do something. And later I would understand much better what "you should not be able to do that" meant. But it's a experience that marked me, and that "you" comes back in my mind and experience several times in the course of my educational experience. But I think that's one of the reasons why I am committed to working with students now around their educational achievement.
Minister Crawford, would you answer that same question about your awareness of your Blackness and your awareness of that Blackness being treated in an oppressive way in this country?
Yes, thank you a great deal, Dr. Crowley. It's a pleasure to join you and Reverend Johnson in this forum, and to those who are streaming in from Burlington Library. My awareness of my identity as a member of an oppressed group happened at a very early age. I believe I was probably 5 or 6 when I really began to learn about who I was, but particularly the kind of community that I was being raised in. For those of you who may not know, I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, from a community better known as Dynamite Hill. It was called Dynamite Hill because it was a community that was often bombed. It was a community that experienced racial terrorism, domestic terrorism, as a consequence of everyday people, teachers, engineers, business persons, organizing in the movements for civil rights and social justice. People that lived on Dynamite Hill were folks like Carol Robertson, one of the 4 little girls who was killed in 16th Street Baptist Church, the 4 young girls whom we commemorated yesterday. There were people such as Addie Drew and John Drew, who hosted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he would come to Birmingham, because hotels and motels would not host him and members of the SCLC as they were organizing for a nonviolent revolution. And so I learned that this community, this everyday community that I grew up in, with neighbors who I thought were everyday people, was a target of racial domestic terror because you had folks who were Black who were organizing for freedom and liberation. It wasn't because of any biological or genetic deficiency, but because of our difference in hue, and because there was a movement to disrupt the status quo. And I didn't think that that was right. My mother sat me down along with my grandparents to teach me this history and how it was one that was born out of struggle, but out of that struggle, there were people who definitively asserted their identity as proud Black people who would not allow terror or fear to allow them to resign and give up on a vision for a greater future. So that's been a history that I've continued to carry with me all the way here to Boston in this present moment.
Thank you. So I identify with both of you in that my grandparents did instill in me an awareness of my Blackness in a very positive way to appreciate that. But they also gave me the talk on when I finally got my license to drive, about what I needed to do if I ever got pulled over, not if, but when I got pulled over as a Black male, whose parents were able to get me a fairly nice car, what I was supposed to do, make sure that I always kept my hands seen, make sure that I always speak polite to the officer so I didn't get killed. My grandmother reminds me of this even now. And that was also a moment when I realized my Blackness. Did either of you ever have that experience of receiving the talk? And what was that like?
I received several talks. I received a talk from my parents as I was growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, as a middle schooler and high schooler, navigating that city. But also when I went to college, I went to Morehouse College, a predominantly Black institution for men. I founded in 1867, wonderful institution. But even at Morehouse, we were given a talk of how we should navigate the city of Atlanta, how our Blackness is perceived in the public square, and the histories that we are carrying with us. And so we're always reminded that our race is of consequence. Even the slightest things, the slightest misstep could result in your death, your untimely death as a Black youth. And so unfortunately, we don't just get to talk from family, but from administrators, from church mothers, from those village members that understand the realities of being Black in America today.
Reverend Johnson?
I absolutely remember the talk, and for me, I think as a female, it was a lot about where you go by yourself, particularly as it pertains to getting my license and driving places alone. And one of the particular times that I remember that conversation was when I first got a car. I attended Howard University, but when I first got a car and I started driving to school, there was a quicker way to get to the highway, the interstate that would get me on to DC from Athens, Georgia. And my grandfather was very specific with me about not going places and not driving through a particular county that I will not name, but not driving through particular places alone and not driving through them after dark. He was always very serious about not going places after certain times if I was going to be alone. But in particular, those conversations were critical. And I remember that being drilled into me. You always are somewhere, you get there in the light, and if you can't leave before it gets dark, stay or get on the phone with someone or whatever you have to do, but don't be anywhere by yourself because we just don't know what'll happen to you.
Yes, so I think this is indicative of the conversations that are had by a lot of African-American parents with their African-American children. And this is an experience that white parents and a discussion that white parents never have to have with their children. And having this discussion and listening to this discussion brings us into awareness that this issue is actually systemic, that it's actually woven into the fabric of what it means to be American. And I think this is a good segue into our first question, because we just got through talking about having the talk, and our parents had the talk with all of us. And might I say, some of you may not understand what we were saying a bit earlier about Morehouse and Howard. There are historically Black colleges and universities that were created for enslaved Africans and freed slaves who could not get accepted into white institutions. And the three of us are both products of those institutions. We're also products of higher ed as well. And so we fit into this Black exceptionalism category, this talented tenth that Du Bois talked about. And a lot of times we like to think of ourselves as being exempt of experiencing this type of overt racism. But the situation that just happened a couple of months ago with Amy Cooper, with a Harvard graduate who was bird watching, is an example that this issue of race is actually a systemic issue, and there's not enough talks that our parents can have with us, or we can have with younger children, to fully protect them from something that is a system. So, Minister Crawford, how is race, in your opinion, made, determined, and constructed? And can you discuss how systemic racism is embedded as a normal practice in nearly every aspect of American life?
Yes, thank you for the question. We have to realize that race, as you mentioned before, is a social construct. That race is not based on biological deficiencies or any exceptional qualities that one might have. But race has been a construct that has been reified throughout generations in order to protect the American caste system. And for those of you who are watching, I would commend Isabella Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, as she chronicles the ways in which before race was the defining factor of the American hierarchy, there was religion, as Christianity was used to demarcate those who were wealthy and privileged Europeans who were landowners in the European colonies, the British colonies here in the United States, and how that was meant to delineate between indentured service, both European and African, and wealthy landowners. But after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, you see this amalgamation of poor whites and Black people coming together to fight economic interests, capital interests that are suppressing those in the lower rungs of the American caste system. And after this, attempt to undo power, after Bacon's Rebellion was squashed, we see the continued reification of Black people, people of African descent, seen as subhuman, seen as chattel and as property, especially as you go into the 1700s and the 1800s, leading up into the Civil War. In this idea of race based on a caste system, which really privileges above Black and white, it's green that's at the bottom of this. It's protecting American economic interests, which is the reason that race has been weaponized in this country for so long, which continues to happen in our time today. To the second point, as far as how race is systemically embedded within our everyday institutions, we just have to interrogate the ways in which we think of Black people or white people based on caricatures or stereotypes or tropes that have been passed down from generation to generation. Again, in the book Caste, Dr. Wilkerson, she speaks of race or ideas of race as members of a play. That when you are casted in a play, you're not yourself. You are seen through the lens of those who have given you that identity. And in many ways, people of African descent are seen as lazy, docile brutes based on myths of Blackness that were propagated after the Civil War in order to protect economic interests, to protect the labor of African people. And so we see that in the ways that we continue to incarcerate folks of African descent based on this idea that we are more prone to criminality. We look at red line districts and how Blackness has been condemned based on Khalil Gibran Muhammad's work that looks at this long history of condemning Blackness and Black people based on stereotypes and tropes. And so what we're called to do in this moment as we're looking at systemic racism is to see how interrogate the ways in which we have bought into these caricatures of whether it's Black docility or second-class citizenship or white supremacy. For all of us have to engage in some type of unlearning in this moment as it pertains to race and how it has maintained an American hierarchy and caste system.
Yes, thank you for that response. And I think that your statements are a perfect setup to lead to our second question, which I'd like to pose to Reverend Johnson, which is, how does white denial or ignorance, or white ignorance about America's racist systems maintain the racial inequities in things like the criminal justice system, employment, housing, healthcare, politics, and education? And I want to add in this too, not just white denial and ignorance, but the white choice to just ignore the privilege that white people have to ignore systemic racism.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Minister Crawford, for that enlightening setup in terms of this history. I think that the first thing I want to just say very quickly to make sure that we're clear on where we're coming from. We talk about denial, is that denial is a very common and almost biological, physiological defense mechanism. So we all deny things for various reasons, but this sort of refusal to accept reality is a protective mechanism against some sort of pain. And so we talk about denial, we're not just talking about denial of fact, as in to say that something is not true, but also denial of awareness or denial of responsibility or of impact. That wasn't my intention. It wasn't my fault. I wasn't there when slavery existed. These sorts of ways in which we deny. And while it is, an adaptive, very primitive response for all of us, for all people, this level at which denial occurs when particularly as it pertains to racism and maintaining racist structures is actually essential to the perpetuation of those systems. Because if you, racism, this system of oppression and advantage, depends upon the collusion and cooperation of white people for its perpetuation. And so you cannot maintain a system without the people who exert the power in this process colluding and cooperating with that system. That is not to say that everybody who benefits from racist systems is actively perpetuating, but cooperation is continuing to allow that perpetuation to take place. And so, while we learn, and many individuals would say, I learned as a child that racism was wrong, that to treat people differently is wrong. But as we grow older, and we consider that we are consistently sort of catechized in the ways of protecting our privileges, of ensuring that other persons cannot advance, or that the playing fields cannot be leveled, this sort of denial that racism exists, it often will occur. What I hear the most frequently now is that I wasn't sort of aware, or I wasn't involved, or that's not me. And as Reverend Crowley, Dr. Crowley alluded to earlier, that this sort of denial of, it wasn't me, or wasn't, this isn't my fault and the responsibility, or how do I get better? This sort of conditioning toward fear and suspicion and stereotype has substituted often for actually knowing any people of color, any Black people. And so we allow ourselves to feel the privilege of numbness, not we all, but it is easy to feel the privilege of numbness, which is to say that you have the capacity, the ability to separate yourself from the situation and not have to actually deal with what is going on. And that internalization of the numbness of the denial allows for actualized racist behavior. And so in this sort of ability to separate oneself and distance oneself and deny the benefits that white individuals receive vis-a-vis these racist structures, it allows individuals to separate themselves such that painful sort of awareness, that tick, that when you get angry about somebody saying that something is racist, that's a signal for you to be able in that moment to accept that. And that acceptance of that allows us no longer to be ignorant about these situations that continue to exist and not continue to perpetuate vis-a-vis our own individual habits, as well as those systems that we participate in on a daily basis.
Yes. And so this leads us to our next question, because I think there is actually a way of describing what it is, Reverend Johnson, that America is denying or not admitting to. A book by Jim Wallace, one that I love, that I like to push all the time because I am a theologian and I like to think about things in theological terms. Because I think about Blackness in theological terms, because I've been so affected by writers like James Cone and many womanist theologians. And he makes the argument, much like I did earlier, that politics, American politics, don't have the ability to cleanse this country of its original sin. He's making this statement because he's claiming that white America thinks that it's been cleansed and forgiven and justified and is rectified of its original sin because of the election of Barack Hussein Obama. And Wallace says American politics cannot cleanse this nation of its original sin. He defines America's original sin as racism, white privilege, and he talks about building a bridge to a new America. He sort of sets up the stage for Ibram Kendi's book for how to be anti-racist. You know, that for him is the ultimate goal, I'd make the argument, of how to reach this new America. So, and Reverend Michael Curry also makes this same claim, whom I love very much for his great preaching at the royal wedding. He says that racism is an original sin and goes on to compare racism to an addiction from which America needs to recover. So, Minister Crawford, do you think that this is an accurate way of describing racism? Why or why not? How would you describe the ongoing nature of racism to the average person? And then lastly, what is the importance of naming racism and calling it out as a sin? And what difference does that make?
I would have to emphatically agree with Bishop Curry in his assessment that racism is the original sin in which we are still recovering from our addiction to it. We have to understand that in America, we seem to have this interpretation of history that, as you mentioned, with the election of Barack Obama, there would be some seismic shift in race relations, or even after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that there would be some substantial shift in the way that people view people of African descent, that we think that moments separate us from the long history, which is problematic, that we have this disjointed hermeneutic of history, this disjointed way of interpreting history that disconnects us from a long legacy that still is permeating within our society today. But we have to see the events of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor that have happened this year cannot be disconnected to plantation slavery in this country leading up to 1865. It cannot be disconnected from Black codes and peonage and sharecropping that happened in this country. It cannot be disconnected from Jim Crow and the creation of the prison industrial complex that was really targeting Black and brown people to fill up our jails and create a disproportionate population in our jails. So as Bishop Curry alludes to, this is an addiction that we're still reeling from, but we cannot fully recover if we continue to separate the past events that have so deeply marked us as a country from our present reality. And it's important for us to really name the long history and the long malady that we're experiencing, because if you cannot sufficiently diagnose the problem, you cannot adequately prescribe a remedy. If we are only looking at tertiary or tangential effects of racism, but we're not naming the exact thing, then we'll still have legacies of inequality. We'll still have legacies of disenfranchisement and segregation based on race, because we're not dealing with the thing itself. It's if we go think theologically or think based on our religious tradition to the Gospels, it was when Jesus was able to name the lesion, or get the name of the lesion that colonized the body of a man who lived amongst the tombs, that he was able to dismiss that lesion from the body. And so we have to adequately name the maladies and how they have not disappeared because of fantastic moments in our history, but we are still unearthing, still unlearning the racist ideas and behaviors that have plagued us since 1619, when the first 20 Africans landed in Virginia as chattel and as property, and that marked the ways that Black people were seen in this country since.
Yes, and I think a prime example of a voice crying out in the wilderness. I'm going to use a Christocentric reference here, but put in a African American twist on it, is James Baldwin, who was constantly calling out America and making her face the sins of racism. I think that is one of the main points of Eddie Glaude's new book that I see right there on your bookshelf, right there to the right. I think it pushes that point. And I think it's very interesting to think about the number of brilliant Black writers and thinkers who have been amplifying the critique for years. But the ability of white people to continue to ignore them, that becomes a privilege in and of itself. To actually be able to have the right to ignore something, it signifies that it's not your problem. And it's the lack of empathy from our white privileged colleagues, many times who sit on the same boards as we do, work in the same areas of employment, who are not willing to speak up. And I think that becomes very important, that a great deal of this work is going to be done through allyship. We can continue to be voices crying out in the wilderness, but until the persons who are empowered and in empire begin to see the validity of our humanity, until they begin to see us as persons who are civil and worthy of respect, then this problem is going to continue. I want to take a turn now, because often we can focus a great deal of the discussion on Black survival from a male-centered perspective. And I think that sexism is, especially African-American sexism, is closely related to racism and comes out of racism, because many of the ways that the West Africans understood village connection did not carry with it many of the patriarchal structures that we see in Eurocentric communities. And many of these patriarchal structures and ideals were enforced and introduced to West African persons as a result of colonization and the Christianization of Africa. I say the same argument about homophobia as well. So for that reason, I want to pose a question to Reverend Johnson. Is racism the same for men and women? And if not, how is it different? How does or could the construct of gender impact the experience of racism, and how does it impact the experience of racism?
Thank you for the question. I think that it's important to note, and I just want to say this in case we don't get back to this point, that when you raise the point of allyship, it's important that that allyship, whether this is getting into this sort of added layer of sexism, but we were talking about racism as well, that it's important that it's not performative. Allyship is not what you do in front of the targeted group. It is what you do when you get in the spaces that only you can sort of move in and out of. So that issue of allyship becomes very important as to how you act when you're not around me. When you're not in my face, what are you doing? And that's where your allyship becomes meaningful. But I think in terms of the question of whether racism is the same for men and women, I certainly can't speak from a male experience. But what I can say is that I think that this question gets at the concept of intersectionality and how various pieces of individual identity build upon each other. And so this experience of racism is complicated and sort of exacerbated in some ways by the realities of sexism as well. And so I am a Black woman, and as a Black cisgendered woman, let me just say that piece, because we're also our trans sisters and brothers out there that are that adds a whole nother layer to that. But there are problems that I might experience because I'm Black. There are problems that I might experience because I'm a woman. And then there's a special little set of problems that I'm going to encounter as a Black woman. And so when we get into these sort of particularities around who we are and how those identities form themselves, it is not to say that we're in the oppression Olympics and we're trying to beat against each other, but it is to say that the experiences and the lived experiences that each of us bring into a space are valuable and important, and addressing the multiplicity of dimensions around identity, and particularly when we're talking in terms of justice, becomes very important, that we don't start to leave individuals out of the conversation or force people to deny parts of who they are in order to push the conversation forward. There's a book that, and for anyone who's interested in women's studies, that I would commend to you, that all the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. It's an anthology of Black women's studies. And it's a very interesting book because it begins to point us toward this reality that when we talk about the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, that was about white women. That was a very different experience. When we talk about a lot of the advances that were made during the civil rights movement, that's not to say that they were not incredible advances, they're not incredibly important, but they were built very often on the backs of Black women while subjugating, in some cases, their experiences. And so so these experiences become very important and very valuable. And white supremacy would teach us that in order to be accepted and respected and heard, you must be as close as possible to a white cisgendered Christian identifying man. And it only adds more bonus if you're land owning, which means your property, which means you have enough money, you're wealthy, formally educated, and all these sorts of things. So my opinion and my life experience becomes more valuable and more valid the closer I get to being a white cisgender man. And so this construct of gender just adds another layer of consideration onto this idea of consuming Blackness, consuming femininity, and ultimately erasing and sort of dismembering individual humanity by dividing us into the pieces that can be sold, very much like they did to Sarah Bartman, where she was dismembered and placed into a museum upon her death, and sort of having this oddity that she was made into and objectified as it, and remained unburied for almost 200 years after she had died, that she was a study and not a human. And that in very many ways becomes this important aspect of oppression in this context.
Yes, and I think I might also add too that I think I think it's very important to add that I think that the experiences of Black women in this country and the experiences that they've had with racism, and especially during the time of slavery, are different from men, though. I want to push that for a moment, because in Black women, we see not only in the form of slavery, them participating in the workforce, but they were also responsible for producing the next generation of the workforce at the hands of the pleasure of their masters and their own terror. So this economic structure of racism is really undergirded, and it's sustained by the reproductive abilities of Black women. Slavery would have never been successful, because you got to understand that you had to purchase an adult slave. But if your adult slaves procreated and the woman bore that child was not even viewed as hers, it was property of the slave owner. So we see the original American workforce is produced on the backs of Black women. And that puts a whole different twist on when you start seeing constructs like the DNC utilizing Black women's backs and shoulders once again to save this country. I celebrate the fact that Michelle Obama was the queen bee and won the trophy for the DNC for the best speech. She beat her husband. She beat the presidential candidate himself. I also celebrate the fact that Kamala Harris is an African-American woman who is now running for vice president. Not the first, might I add, but that's another historical thing to be added in that a lot of people are getting mixed up and wrong. I celebrate that, but I see the DNC once again trying to fix this country and sustain it economically, politically, and culturally with the help of Black women. The civil rights movement was a work of Black women. There were Black male spokespersons. So that means the very change of this country's very legal system around voting, etc., is on the back of Black women. Dare I even bring in persons like Pauli Murray, which brings in a varying discussion around gender, and then even thinking about Rosa Parks as not being a tired, helpless woman, but as being an educated woman who was a strategist towards racial change and equality. So I say that to lead into this next question, because I fall into this category. Knowing all of this history, being aware of all of the attempts that Black women, Black men, Black queer people like James Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, the list goes on, the whole Harlem Renaissance was all queer. You know, these individuals being aware of this and knowing that I am still racially profiled. You can read Charles Ogletree's Presumption of Guilt, and I wrote a section in his book about the racism that I experienced as a student at Harvard University. Knowing all of this Black history and this Black activism, while also being aware of my Blackness and how it is not still fully accepted in this country, has led me into a place of absolute rage, where I want to set shit on fire.
Yes, sir.
So my question is, what is Black rage? And can you help those who are listening to understand the righteousness in Black anger? I'm going to give this to Minister Crawford.
Thank you. We have to recognize that Black people are people, that we can't look at Black people as those who are exempt from emotions, from anger. And so when you look at the state of our country as it is right now, with the titular head of white supremacy being the 45th president of the United States, spewing all types of xenophobic rhetoric from his seat. When you look at the continual assault on Black and brown bodies in this country, and you look at the ways in which the leadership, those who we are supposed to call on to serve and protect us, don't see us as fully humans, which has been the long-standing call, the very basic call for Black people in this country, which is to be seen as human beings, that our humanity would be valued and dignified in the public square. And when that is consistently disregarded, the consequence of that is rage. It is righteous rage. You could say it is prophetic rage. When the people who are made in the image of God and the likeness of the divine are treated as if they are the scum of the earth, or the wretched of the earth, as Frantz Fanon would say, it triggers this sense of isolation, desperation, and rage. Such rage that would not be alien to anyone else or any other group of people who are consistently targeted and abused by the power structure of your society, by those who lead the American caste system. And so when we see buildings burning in our country, this is not something that's coming ex nihilo, out of nothing, but it comes out of a collective rage. This rage that goes back to forebears such as Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser, three Black preachers in the Lord's army whose righteous anger led them to lead rebellions across the American South. And many people would disregard that as an illegitimate response to suffering and to oppression, where we like to lift up the nonviolent models of response. And to be sure, I am a practitioner of nonviolent direct action and the Kingian philosophy and methods of nonviolence. However, we cannot disregard another part of our history or another part of our tradition that includes rage and violence towards property when people are no longer valued in the public square.
Well, I want to interrupt you right quick for a second. Why did you feel the need to make a disclaimer around being a supporter of nonviolent action in a dialogue around rage? Is there any politics of respectability in that? And if so, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, I think that nonviolence is the respectful means of response by Black people in America. That we love to lift up the models of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin and Howard Thurman, and how they have helped us to think about nonviolence. And it is, I think it's a sense that if you don't acknowledge that, then you're not seen as a part of a legitimate part of the Black tradition, that you're not fully engaged. But I want to lift up this idea that rage is definitely part of our tradition, and that rage is a fuel in order to help us to do the work of recreating or achieving the country that we know we can have, as James Baldwin would say, to achieve our country, and to, as Dr. King would say, make it true to what it says on paper. But to ignore rage and to ignore the reality of it is to stymie what it means to be a human being. And to be disingenuous with what we're experiencing in this moment.
So let's move into another area that I think, for me personally, brings a bit of not only disappointment but often rage, and that is this topic of white guilt and white fragility. And I want to throw that to both of you. We'll start with Reverend Johnson and then go to Minister Crawford and then hit our final question and we'll be done. How does white fragility and white guilt get in the way or hinder the progress of race relations in America? And how are white fragility and white guilt re-traumatizing to the African American psyche as a whole?
I think that when we start talking about white fragility and white guilt, it's an interesting sort of way in which we at the same time use these pathologies of power and privilege to sustain the system, but also then want to be treated. People want to be treated with kid gloves, and we want to sort of have this moment of mourning and I'm so sad over what it is that has happened, and I think it gets in the way in terms of sort of deferring to people of color, to Black people, without actually getting to the problem. So you can sort of have this moment where I want to bring you in, I want to give you a seat at the table, I want you to lead the conversation, but you don't want to be in a conversation with me. You want me to tell you what I want you to do and direct in such a way that you get to get out of, you still get to escape the moment of having to reckon with this thing. And so I think that these concepts of particularly of white fragility, but also of white guilt, that they get in the way of being able to have a meaningful and genuine exchange of ideas and sort of deal with the level playing field. And so I think that there's still these modes of obfuscating what we really have the capacity to do and what must happen in any real meaningful work that's going to progress us forward. In terms of sort of being re-traumatizing, it puts us back in a situation. I know, at least for me, it puts me back in a situation where it upsets me, it makes me angry, because you want me to care for you about something that you have made me experience. And so it is not allowing either of us to take full responsibility of feeling our own feelings and not having to sort of do the dance around the feelings of white people when we're trying to get to the root of racism. And instead, I often feel that we're having to be put in the situation where we want the victim to make everybody feel better. And instead of having the conversation, having the exchange, coming to the table, recognizing that this is going to be hard and it's going to be some moments of pain, but everybody going to take responsibility for their own pain, because your pain is your work and my pain is my work, and our pain collectively is the work that we have to do together. So this is, everybody's hurting, but your pain is not my responsibility in this moment.
Thank you.
Mr.
It was, yeah, it was Frantz Fanon in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, that makes mention or notes that oppression not only warps or harms the oppressed, not only harms those who are targeted, but those who practice the colonization. And in America, the architects, the purveyors of violence, of racism, have been those who are white, who benefited from white privilege and white supremacy. And so to that end, for folks to simply see themselves as allies in dismantling racism and white supremacy, as opposed to the folks who are leading that case, since their ancestors were the ones who helped reify and fortify the infrastructure of racism, it doesn't make sense to me. You can't take a sideline responsibility or sideline action when your legacy, your ancestry was responsible for building the foundation of the structure of racism that we are experiencing at this moment. And so I appreciate what what Reverend Johnson said, as white fragility gets in the way, as it allows white people to defer to Black people. We should be cognizant of the type of labor that we're asking people, Black people to do, that we're asking the oppressed to do when we're talking about being anti-racist or decolonizing this society that we're in, when we should look and interrogate the ways in which we're being privileged and that we're benefiting from these legacies, and divest ourselves from it without asking consistently Black and brown sisters and brothers to do that work for us.
All right, our final question. What steps should predominantly white institutions and institutions of higher learning take to address racism and to dismantle racism? We're going to just do this very quickly to just list some thoughts. We'll start with Reverend Johnson, and then we'll go directly to Minister Crawford, and then we'll open up for questions from our participants.
I think that for me, the first step is always going to go back to that piece of denial, that you have to be able to accept realities as they are, and then make that concerted commitment to address the systems that you've now woken up to uncover. So I think that it's that starting with that denial and that commitment to radical honesty about what it is that is going on, and a commitment to move forward, recognizing that power that allowing for equal distribution of power does not mean that somebody's got to be on the bottom. It's not a top-down situation. If we're trying to level, then we're trying to let everybody be on the same playing field.
Mr. Crawford?
I would think that institutions should think critically about how they can participate in this reparations movement that's happening across the country. We've seen Princeton Theological Seminary, Georgetown University, Virginia Theological Seminary all make commitments to provide reparations packages for the descendants of enslaved Africans, and as well as just thinking about the ways in which they can build into their budget ways to be equitable and to bring in more students of color into their institutions. And also just thinking about the ways that these institutions relate to their surrounding communities. I was a student at the University of Chicago before I moved to Massachusetts. And the relationship that the university had with the South Side, with its Black residents, is troubling at best. But thinking of the ways that institutions can invest in those communities that have been displaced and divested from as a consequence of their expanding their territory and their power is something I think that we can do that offers some concrete ways to move forward beyond our diversity and inclusion efforts.
Yes, yes, I think that's great. And if I were to offer some steps, I would go back to what I was saying earlier, Stop asking Black people what to do. And I would also ask majority institutions to stop asking their Black employees that they're probably already underpaying to join committees to fix the issues in their institutions. The institutions across the board need to do institution-wide reads of Ibram Kendi's book on how to be anti-racist, and then hire a consultant to measure and evaluate the anti-racist and or racist aspects of their company and to come up with next steps. Another thing that these institutions can do is bring equal amount of people of color into leadership and not just tokens. In other words, not just hiring the one Black person over diversity, but actually diversifying the entire C-suite, which means that there will be moments when these positions, which have been historically held by white persons, will not be held by white persons, and that the boards might perhaps brown beyond what the expectation is of just having a simple few. I think white people also have to be willing to sacrifice and even lose their cultural, social, and economic capital for the leveling of the playing fields for all persons. This is in the form of reparations. Now, I just want to say one suggestion that I've thought about for reparations over and over. I'm going to throw this out here. I don't know what people will think about it. But if people of African descent and if people from African descent were used as slaves, then descendants of slaves should not be paying property taxes or taxes in general in this country if our ancestors' blood was used to establish it. Maybe we can start the conversation with there and extend it then to paying off these student loans. And then the last thing I think that America needs to do is to admit its racist histories. We still have members of the GOP who won't even say that racist histories actually exist. We have large factions in our government that won't even support us trying to take down these statues, which are reminders of America's racist history. They have reinterpreted the history. So I think if we could do that, and if we could continue to have institutions, much like Minister Crawford said, to create microscopic models of reparations in their own context, much like did Princeton. Before we end, Mr. Crawford, did you want to say something else?
Yes, I just wanted to know on the idea of America acknowledging its racist history. There's been a debate recently of the president pushing back against Nicole Hannah-Jones' production, the 1619 Project, being taught in schools across this country, with the argument saying that it is anti-American. It's anti-American rhetoric, anti-American propaganda. But I want us to pay attention to what's being said there. Anti-American, really being anti the myths and anti the narratives that have been propagated about white exceptionalism in this country, anti the myths that have been said about Blackness in this country. So we need to cut through all the noise that's happening in this moment and really get to what is being said in places of power in our country. So just wanted to make that note, Pastor.
Yes. Thank you. All right. I think it's on Ms. Smith now.
Much of the chat this evening has been sharing book titles. The Just Mercy and the other book by the author who did the cast, The Warmth of Other Suns. Yeah, Warmth of the Other Suns, and trying to sort out exactly who the author was that you were describing before Jim Wallace. But I did get one question, actually, oh, now they're pouring in, wouldn't you know it? From Susan. She wants to know, how do you overcome the proclivity of human beings to form cliques and identify elements of society as us versus them?
I'll take an initial stab and say that I think it begins with a form of education. I think it could be argued that it is an issue of nurture. I won't say nature, but an issue of nurture for individuals to seclude themselves in silos based off of issues of class, skin color, hair type. I think that is a natural, an element of nurture and culture. But I think education and educating people on the equality of all persons, and trying to find out where are the areas in our systems of education that reinforce these models of what is right. I think about school books that only have depictions of white children in them. I think about movies that always show wholesome white families living these middle-class lives. So I think to a great extent, exposure and education can help us to rethink a lot of these silos that we are in.
And another question from Denise. She feels that white people think that she says, disclaimer, I'm white, that we own the history of America because the forefathers were white. How do we go about changing that?
I think that at least part of that, I'll take an initial sort of stab at the question. I think that at least part of that goes back to something that Reverend Crowley said earlier, that it is part of it is living into the reality of the narratives of this country. You can't feel like you can feel like you own your story, but if you're not telling the whole story, you can't own the history of a nation, because there are more people than just white people involved in the founding of the country. And so we can go with the narratives of the forefathers, but we cannot neglect the narratives of the indigenous people that were already here before they got here. We cannot neglect the narratives of those individuals on whom the economic basis of this country was built, be they Black or otherwise. We cannot neglect the fact that North America was not first inhabited by white people. So the history of America is a very complicated thing. And if we are only going to tell the stories of the white forefathers or the white people who wrote the narratives, I think that we live into very often, then we can't start to change those stories until we allow those other histories and those other narratives to live and to stand on their own, and not try to require people to validate their history and their existence by not allowing them to tell their stories.
Thank you. And I think we have time for just one more question.
And I want to ask that you go to James's question.
So James prefaces his question by saying, respectfully, this discussion seems to be a step backwards in the desperate need for our country to continue making social process towards equality and freedom for all. Question, aren't you declaring whites, who apparently can be universally characterized as being numb, non-empathetic, oppressive, filled with denial, to be the second-class citizen? Doesn't sound enlightened to me. Sounds like a new form of racism. And then there's a second question. Do you want to just tackle that one first, or?
Well, let's just go here on both. So then
Okay. Then the second one is, rather than describing this country as having a non-correctable original sin of racism, can't we see a continuing process of enlightenment and liberation from one generation to the next? Don't we have faith that this progress can continue and even hasten?
Well, to that second question, I would argue that I don't think any of us have argued that the original sin is non-correctable. That the issue of racism is still pervasive, not necessarily because we don't have the capacity to eliminate it, but we haven't demonstrated the will as a nation, as a people, to eradicate racism's impact on our lives and our material lives today. I wouldn't want us to mischaracterize what's being said, but that racism is a reality that dates back to the founding of this country, the founding of the colonial project, and if we are truly to eliminate it, we must face it, we must embrace it, we must meet it with behaviors that seek to see the value and human dignity of all people. But just wanted to make that point as far as not mischaracterizing what's been said so far.
I think I want to respond to this and just say that I think the question now, and I hope that this doesn't come off the wrong way, but I do think that the question carries with it this sort of white desire, a white hope to have this sort of clean history of America that is constantly progressing. And while this might be the perspective of a white person who has been able to sit in their white privilege and watch the country go from the era of slavery through Jim Crow, and to read this history and to see America as being on this path toward progression, and reading very kindly the history of racist white Americans who owned slaves in the past, restricting that to being a reflection of the times in some way, trying to prevent from allowing the forefathers of this country to be demonized. I think all of that is a very intentional and persuasive form of shaping and telling American history that we spoke about earlier, that actually does more harm because it does not bring awareness to it. And my question is often, what is it about bringing or admitting America's participation in racism continuously and its participation in slavery? What is it about that that indicts whiteness and somehow prevents a white person from being able to claim the history? Why is it that portion of the history is wanting to be sanitized, to be made more palatable? And I think that in and of itself becomes an act of racism. It becomes an act of violence to try and paint a picture of the experiences of an entire group of people, an entire ethnicity, in a way that is more palatable to the white American narrative that so many white Americans hold dear and near. I say that because for many Black persons, yes, it may seem like progress that is happening over time, but it's our lives that's being discussed and that's being laid on the lines. You know, when I think about the vice president of this country will not say Black Lives Matter because of his belief of its alignment with certain ideals that go against Christocentric norms. The inability to even say that these lives matter because of his intentional way of trying to shape the narrative of America. He's trying to preserve a very particular narrative in his resistance of saying that statement. And the upholding of that sanitized narrative, in my opinion, is a great deal of the problem. It's the problem with the history books in our schools. It's the problem with white Christian churches who try to act like they did not have a major role in slavery in this country. Many of their endowments have been made as plush as they are because of their involvement in slavery. And when you have every fabric of this country reminding a people of our oppressive state, where are we supposed to see this progressiveness coming from that America is hypothetically going through that you're suggesting in this question? Did that progress happen in Ferguson? Did that progress happen in the recent issues with Breonna Taylor in Louisville? Did they happen with the issue with George Floyd? So I'm trying to figure out where this progress happened actually. Because if the progress had happened as quickly as many white conservatives would like to claim that it has, then we would not continue to see these outbursts of police brutality. We would not continue to see these issues of racism that are happening consistently. And I think the only reason that we're seeing them now, being inundated with them now, isn't because they're just now popping back up because of Donald Trump. I think it's an intersection between social media, everybody having phones on them, and it being publicized in ways that's putting it in our face that's much reminiscent of the era of Emmett Till, when his mother decided to put the picture of him in that casket on a magazine.
I don't know if you've been following the chat, but over and over again, people are thanking you that these are such important ideas that you've been talking about tonight. And over and over again, I think that our attendees are much more eloquent than I. These are opinions we need to hear and understand from Suzanne, from Shannon. Wow, this is wonderful. Thank you for all your insights. Human value and dignity for all people, over and over again. Thank you so much. And I just, you know, it keeps going on. And I just want to echo that as well. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And gee, maybe we can invite you back. We would invite you back, but maybe you would come. It would seem like such a nice wrap-up program at the end of our social justice series if we could have something on ideas about reparations. You know, it was interesting to hear that tonight, part of your thoughts, but I think you could probably go on and on. So thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Minister Crawford and Reverend Johnson. Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Smith, for allowing us to share. Thank you.